Hello and welcome to Game Design Hour. I'm your host, Miles Goldsmith, and on each episode, I interview the people who create the video games you know and love. On today's episode, I'm interviewing one of the amazing people behind the video game Kerbal Space Program 2. Kerbal Space Program 2 is a sequel to the hit game Kerbal Space Program. In Kerbal Space Program 2, you build rockets, send them into outer space, and explore the universe. Without any further ado, let's meet our guest and get into the interview.
My name is Nate Simpson. I'm creative director for KSP2.
So, what was the first thing that really sparked your interest in creating video games?
Oh, wow, we're going way back. Okay, well, then I have to tell a story of nepotism. I graduated from high school in 1993. My father was one of the founders of a video game company called the Dreamers Guild. Actually, I don't think he technically founded it. I think he joined shortly after it was founded. But my first summer out of high school, I needed a job and I had some art background. And so I worked on a little video game called Fast Action Pack, which was really just a series of kind of knockoff 2D arcade games. And what I learned was, even though I pursued originally a career as a paleontologist and was going to the University of Chicago to study geophysics, on the summers, I kept coming back home to Chatsworth, California, and working at the Dreamers Guild. And once you've worked at a game company for long enough, you develop relationships with other people in the industry. And I attempted another career. I attempted a couple of other careers over the years, but I've always ended up coming back to video games. Once you have that sort of social network in place, it is a place it's easy to come back to.
What made you want to switch from those other careers to video games?
Well, I've had different answers at different times in my life. It's easy for me to say that working on Kerbal Space Program is absolutely a labor of love. I love Kerbal and would be doing this if I could under any circumstances. There have definitely been seasons of my life when I chose this career because it was the only thing that as an artist I could do and pay the bills. It's either that or be an artist of the starving variety. I had a a short attempt to be a comic book creator and did a comic for Image Comics called Non-Player. And again, a real labor of love and a thing that was not really paying the bills.
When thinking about the next game that you were going to make, what made you all decide to go and make a second Kerbal Space Program game?
Let's see, that is also a complicated answer. The original space program was created by a man named Felipe Falange at a company called Squad in Mexico City. And that game, over the course of a decade, became what Kerbal Space Program is today. The KSP IP was purchased by Private Division, which is a label under Take-Two Interactive. I don't know how many years ago, relatively recently. And it was at that time that a sequel began to be developed. And I happened to be working at a company that bid to work on the sequel. You know, I've told this story before, but let's see. So I was working at a company called Uber Entertainment at the time, and we heard that we might be able to make a proposal for KSP2. And when my company found out that it was a possibility, I was at coffee. I was away from the office. So when I returned from coffee, everyone was sitting in a semicircle with these Cheshire Cat grins because they all knew I was Kerbal superfan number one. I had like 2,000 hours in the game at that point. And so they asked, I think it was Jeremy Abels who asked, so Nate, if we were to work on a Kerbal Space Program 2, any ideas what you would improve? And like I had a lot of thoughts about what the sequel should be. So we were kind of off to the races.
When starting work on the sequel, what were some of the things about the first game that you sort of looked at and were like, this is what I want to improve on and this is what I want to change about the game?
Well, I should start by saying I think that KSP1 is the greatest game of all time. So it's a very, very high bar. And it's important to understand what it is about that game that makes it so special. At times, I've thought about it more as a creative medium than as a game. And one of the special things about it is that it can be played very differently by different people. And I've often had to break my habit of assuming that the way I play it is the way other people should play it. You don't want to close off anyone's avenue. You don't want to yuck anybody's yum. So a big part of it was just finding a way to make the core game loop scalable, because many of the things that I was hoping to do in KSP2 involved greater scale, both in terms of the scale of the universe, so that we could turn it into an interstellar experience as opposed to just a single star system, but in terms of vehicle size. And KSP uses, and KSP2 also uses Unity rigid body physics, which is CPU constrained. And so there are a lot of things that get harder and harder to do, both in terms of universe scale, vehicle scale. We also want to do colonies, which tend to be large. We also want to do multiplayer, which just, of course, multiplies the CPU burden. So everything needed to be bigger and more complicated, but we also wanted to preserve the core physics. A lot of deep architectural work went into sort of redesigning the core of the game so that all of these systems were scalable. And that's an ongoing effort. Like we're still finding ways to make it increasingly scalable over the course of early access.
Pretty much every game has interesting or different ideas that are thought about at one point that get cut or maybe pushed down along the line for further updates. What were some interesting ideas that during the development process were talked about but have either been cut or you're aiming to put them in a later update?
Yeah, that's a good question. And part of what makes it complicated for Kerbal is that, like the original Kerbal Space Program, we want to keep modability in mind as well, right? Kerbal has a very, very rich modding community. And in many situations, especially in matters of realism, if you don't get to it as the designer, the community will get to it later. And I don't know how well acquainted you are with the original KSP, but I mean, there's Principia, which is like an n-body physics mod, and there's Real Solar System, and there's just like a lot of things that you can almost sort of expand the game so that it is a one-to-one recreation of the actual solar system. And to some extent, the existence of those mods takes away a little bit of the burden to sort of hyper focus on realism, right? The goal then becomes, what is the best core default gameplay experience? And with that in mind, there have certainly been game mechanics that we have, I would say, contemplated and then had to deprioritize in favor of other things that are more core to the core progression. I'll give you one example. So over the course of early access, what this game will become is sort of our version of career. Is called exploration mode. And what you'll be doing is going to new celestial bodies, discovering and extracting unique resources, which are different from body to body, using those extracted resources to build colonies, using those colonies as nodes in a delivery route system, in which each time you deliver any quantity of resources, either natural or synthesized, between two colonies, you can automate that so that it then continues to move those resources to the other location. And then use those resources, presumably you would have orbital colonies that are hubs to which multiple resource routes are delivering to a single vehicle construction site where you're making these truly colossal interstellar vehicles. There's a lot of moving parts to that and a lot to do. And the question is, how many other layers of realism do you want to add on top of that may complicate or, add some difficulty to what you're trying to do over the course of that core gameplay loop? One example, a thing that is frequently talked about on this team, and that I would not rule out in the far future, is the idea of radiation. Especially when you're getting to these next generation interstellar capable engines like inertial confinement fusion, or Z-pinch fusion, or there's a lot of stuff that makes a lot of radiation. So it would make sense, when you have an Orion-style nuclear pulse engine that literally spits out nuclear bombs and blows them up against the pusher plate, that you would have to deal with the effects of radiation. But in the near term, radiation does not make the game more fun. In the long term, it may. And that sort of thing, different people on the team are differently passionate about. I think radiation is totally rad, and rad. Is that a radiation pun? But yeah, we want to have all the toys, but we have to make them in a certain order. So we'll see if we're able to get to that.
So the game focuses on building rockets and launching into space, all things that in real life involve very, very complex math and complex ideas. How much research did you do into the real life side of all of this, and how does that play into the game?
Well, there's a couple of answers to that question. Obviously, we're dealing with Newton's laws, and those are, I think, realistically portrayed. However, there are some areas where we deal with sort of abstractions or simplifications, generally for gameplay reasons. For example, every celestial body in the game has a defined sphere of influence within which you are only affected by a single body's gravity. And that's not how real gravity works. They thought that's called n-body physics. In a real solar system, you're experiencing the gravitational pull of everything else in the solar system, and even things outside the solar system. And that's why there are some mods even that simulate n-body physics. But when you're dealing with n-body physics, you start to have to consider things that will probably degrade the gameplay for the vast majority of players. You start, like when you have satellites, you have to start worrying about station keeping, and things get a little bit out of whack over time, and you have to deal with the same problems that people who control satellites have to deal with in the real world. So there is a limit to the realism, at which point it starts to get a little bit burdensome for the player. There are other areas that are probably in a similar vein, like life support, things like that. Again, no two people will entirely agree about what the threshold of appropriate realism is, which is why we cherish the modders. But to answer your question, it's an approximation of the universe. It's not a perfect recreation of the universe, because in the end, it is also a game that needs to be fun.
What sort of research did you do into the real life side of all of the rocket stuff?
So we have people who specialize in different areas. We have Chris Adderley. He's our part designer. He actually has a background in aerospace. And he was also a notable modder in the KSP1 community. He went by the name Nertea. I believe he still does. And he has a surprisingly deep knowledge of spacecraft propulsion and aerospace matters. And a big part of that I'm discovering is that he is extremely good at researching things. He doesn't know everything. He knows an awful lot. But when he doesn't know something, he is extremely good at finding relevant information, digging up, primary sources, looking up papers. So, it's very easy to trust that the designs that he comes up with are heavily rooted in some real engineering principles. We also talk a lot with subject matter experts. We've talked to Dr. Yuri Shumlak, who is building a Z-pinch fusion device in the basement of, or has built, I should say, it already exists, in the basement of the University of Washington. Let's see, Dr. Joel Green is at Johns Hopkins, has given us some assistance on celestial body design. He worked on the James Webb Space Telescope team. So there are people we can go to for subject matter expertise. So in general, we start out with a gameplay requirement, and then we talk to someone who understands the real science. We always hold ourselves to the standard of, if a curious person experiences something in the game and wonders if it's real or if it speaks to something in real life, they can go to Wikipedia and look it up and discover, oh, that is a thing that is being researched, or that is a thing that exists in some space vehicles, and sort of have it be a jumping off point for some personal exploration or discovery.
So managing scope is really important when creating video games. How do you work to manage the scope of Kerbal Space Program while you're working on it? And how has the scope changed from what you started with to what you have now?
Well, this is always a challenge on every video game, because our eyes are always bigger than our stomachs. For KSP2, it is an immense challenge, because it is a game where you can lose yourself in attempting to recreate the real universe, right? There's no obvious upper limit to the amount of things you might try to shoehorn into the game. And there's no shortage of people out in the community encouraging you to attempt to shoehorn everything from the universe into your game. So it takes a combination of restraint on the part of the design team, a sort of common sense notion of what should be in the game, and also let's call it an uneasy alliance with the production team, who have the job of making sure that we can execute against our production obligations within a time frame and on budget. So sometimes there's tense conversations. Sometimes design really, really wants something, and production has to tell us that it's not tenable on the timeline that we have, or that, I think more frequently they say, well, maybe that's something for a later milestone, which is their way of kind of deferring the conversation. But yeah, it's there's a certain amount of horse trading that's always going on in terms of what we're able to get into the game within a shorter timeline. But the nice thing is that KSP1 continued to evolve and grow over an entire decade. And our hope is that KSP2 has similar longevity. So, provided there are people out there who are willing to go along with us on this ride, it's more a question of when, not if, we're able to get to all the additional fun stuff that we were hoping to do early on.
What was your process for playtesting the game, and what sort of important information do you learn through playtesting?
So we have QA. We actually have both PDQA and IGQA, two teams that test and validate the game. And they could probably give you a much more precise answer. I can speak to my personal experience of playtesting the game. I try to play it every day. And, I don't think there's any substitute for attempting to do ambitious things in the game, because this is a game that is deceptively, what's the word I want to use for this? It has an infinite number of edge cases in a way that most other games do not. It is very possible to think that you have a completely bulletproof system when you are flying with, let's say, just trying to get a vehicle to orbit, right? With a relatively simple set of parts. You can pretty much fully explore that player story and have a fairly high degree of certainty that there aren't any blocking or game breaking bugs lurking in that part of the game loop. But because in this game you can do almost anything, you're constantly having to challenge yourself to attempt to do things that are on the ambitious side or the weird side or the illogical side. You're trying to go places that you don't think other people would attempt to go. And again, it's at this current moment, it's a fully explorable solar system. But going forward, it's going to be multiple solar systems. So the challenge of fully testing this physics sandbox, grows literally exponentially as the game itself evolves. We have automated testing. We're able to get a lot of the core stuff tested, but it really is, the devil really lies in the details around individual part modules and how those parts interact with one another, and bizarre physics edge cases that happen when you happen to attach one part to a parent part to another parent part, and just those three parts in that sequence causes something strange to happen. And there's a lot of stuff like that that'll kind of drive you bonkers, but it's also pretty fun because you get to play Kerbal Space Program for a living, and that's not the worst. So yeah.
What's the difference between the two play testing teams you talked about at the start of that question?
Oh, so one is Private Division quality assurance, and one is Intercept Games quality assurance. Intercept Games quality assurance is embedded with the studio. And so they're kind of much more integrated into the sort of moment-to-moment testing of new systems. And when we find a bug in our own internal testing, we'll discuss it with them, try to work through it, figure out what's going on. Private Division quality assurance are much more heavily involved in validating builds before they go out into the world. And sometimes they also will chip in if they don't have too much on their plates for the first thing. They'll chip in on testing for other things internally.
Which parts of Kerbal Space Program 2 did you have to put the most time and effort into to get just the way you wanted it?
There's the answer that is about me personally, and then there's probably the larger collective answer around what area of the game had to see the most iteration or work to get it to a good place. Gosh, I feel like I've poured so many thousands of hours into this game in so many different areas. It's hard to tell which of them used up the most of my bandwidth. Maybe I could just mention a couple of things that I remember putting a lot of work into. So there are certain areas of physics tuning that required a huge amount of iteration. I think the thing that looms largest in my memory is procedural wings. I'm very happy to see that the procedural wings are being well received right now since KSP2's release, because they went through a long period of growing pains where the control surfaces would tend to do the opposite of what you wanted them to do, but only in certain circumstances, and sometimes it was hard to tell which circumstances were triggering that.
For people who aren't as familiar with the game, what are procedural wings?
Oh, yes. So they are wings that you can edit. So when you're building a vehicle, instead of in KSP1, you would make wings out of a series of small modular parts, like that were triangles and rectangles, and you'd kind of cobble them together into this patchwork quilt that would then be wing shaped. For KSP2, there's a much lower number of wing parts that are highly customizable. You've got all kinds of sliders to control their length and their angle and the chord length, tip angle. There's a lot of things. And they also have integrated control surfaces, meaning ailerons, elevons, rudders that are built into those wing parts. So it was a completely new system for KSP2, and in its first incarnation, it did very little correctly, and it required a lot of just kind of just felt like trying to run through molasses or something. Like you get it 1% better, and then it would get 2% worse, and then you get it 3% better, and that was a trial, but we poured a lot of love into that system, and it really seems to have come together quite nicely. And we're very pleased to see the kinds of things people are building with those wings. So that's something kind of from my recent memory. I mean, it would really depend on the team you ask as well. Obviously, the core architecture of the game has been a real mountain to climb, and probably at the core of the challenge there is. Let me see if I can describe this in a generally accessible way. So the way that KSP1 calculates orbital physics, it uses something called patched conics, which basically is just calculating ellipses, the behavior of bodies while they coast in an orbit, non-accelerating trajectories. So it's sort of old school, simple physics. But one of our goals for KSP2, because we intend to simulate interstellar vehicles, there's a new requirement that those vehicles need to be able to accelerate continuously over very long periods of time, like years in some cases. And then you flip, and then you do a retro burn, and you decelerate continuously until you get to your destination. And those kind of trajectories are non-elliptical trajectories. They tend to actually take on some quite strange shapes on occasion. They're maybe more akin to spirals, or an unraveled spiral or something like that. And in order to facilitate that, and especially in order to facilitate the use of time warp over those very long duration burns, we needed to completely overhaul the way the game handles the calculation of position and velocity. And then that was further complicated by the humongous scale of the game. At interstellar scales, you cannot comprehend how much bigger this game is when you have to deal with interstellar scales. So the game had to be fundamentally re-architected to allow for all of those things to be possible, especially the planning of those non-elliptical trajectories. Just took all new math. It was, again, lots and lots of iteration, a brilliant effort on the part of our engineers. And it's coming together. In fact, even now, when you play the early access version of KSP2, when you plan a maneuver now, you can actually see a little red trajectory that is non-elliptical over the course of the planned burn. And then you see a nice little elliptical trajectory once the burn ends, just to show you what your vehicle will do once it stops accelerating. I hope that made sense.
At the start of the game, the player is able to go through a series of tutorials that explain rocket building, launching, and controlling the rocket while it's in space. I felt like these tutorials were pretty helpful and useful with learning the game. With elements in the game being so complex, how did you decide what elements would and wouldn't be included in those tutorials?
Oh, okay. I'm so glad you asked this one, because I think in some ways, the main justification for the existence of KSP2 is to improve its approachability. And sometimes we have to be very careful in the way that we talk about this, because we did not make the game easier. It's actually important that the core game loop remain just as challenging as it ever was. But we wanted to invite more people into this experience. And I say that as a fan. It's actually something that's kind of unique about the KSP community is the degree to which it welcomes newcomers. Like you'll see people come into the KSP subreddit. They're just trying to figure out how to get a rocket off the ground. And a bunch of people will come in and help talk them through it. And we felt like we could really do a lot of good in terms of boiling those core concepts down to an easily digestible, entertaining, funny, and relatively fast-paced tutorial experience. Because so many of those concepts, when they're conveyed verbally, sound really tricky. And when they're conveyed visually, they kind of just click. And I would say, you asked earlier what systems we poured the most work into, especially in the early life of the project. That was probably my number one priority. We did them on paper. We drew cartoons. We did animatics. We made whole animations, then threw them away. Like we did so many iterations of those tutorials, trying to get them tighter, denser, make sure that they're fun, make sure that they're snappy, and make sure that they teach. And then trying them out on each other. Trying anytime any new person comes into the company, often we hire people onto the team who maybe have not played a whole lot of Kerbal Space Program. And it's a great, like the first thing we do to them is like, all right, first play these tutorials. Let's tell us what you think. So we've done a huge amount of testing on them. And maybe the thing I'm most excited about in the early days of KSP2 being available to the public is we're hearing from a lot of people that when they may have found the on-ramp into KSP1 a little bit daunting, but KSP2 has been much easier for them to get into. And then they can even go back to KSP1 and thrive in that game too, because they've figured out all the core concepts. That's a huge win.
You talked about using Unity to create the game. What was your experience with working with Unity to create Kerbal Space Program 2?
So I am not an engineer, and so my ability to speak with convincing specificity about the pluses and minuses of Unity is pretty limited. I have worked with Unity on previous projects. I would say probably the primary reason for our having chosen Unity for KSP2 is that it was the engine for KSP1. And we knew that it could get a lot of the core operations done that we needed for KSP2. Yeah, I'm not sure what else I could bring to that answer, really.
Well, I haven't played much of Kerbal Space Program 1. I feel like Kerbal Space Program 2's building system is easier than the first game. Was this something you were intentionally trying to do? And if so, what steps were you taking to make that change?
Definitely the user experience and user interface were early candidates for improvement. The example I always like to give out is, as part of the first time user experience in KSP1, you get a rocket out onto the pad, and there is no button in the visible user interface to make it go. The first thing you do in the game is hit the space bar. And if you don't know the hotkey, you're literally lost. That is not a fantastic. I mean, of course, you could learn that the space bar makes the vehicle go. It's not like a big deal, but it's like as part of a first-time user experience, it's not amazing. And there are so many things like that where there's just maybe a low-hanging fruit in terms of just communicating a concept just a little bit more clearly, or making the control for that subsystem a little bit more accessible. And the UX is constantly in flux. People have even commented on some of the areas of the user interface changing between release and patch 1 3 weeks later. There will be more UI changes going into future patches as well. And of course, we're learning from things we hear from the community over the course of development. So when we talk about approachability, the user experience is a huge part of that, right? Like there is a kind of UI design that communicates clearly to the player what the intent of a given control is, and we're always looking for opportunities to improve that.
Are there any small little fun details that you've added into the game that you don't see many players notice but you really like?
That's a pretty hard thing. It's pretty hard to pull a fast one on this community. People notice details pretty consistently. I mean, we try to, even down to like the plumbing on specific rocket engines, we're often trying for an unusual level of authenticity. And I think sometimes people appreciate that. And it's nice when they see it because, you put in the extra work for it. And it's cool when somebody notices that you did the work. Personally, well, I personally put a lot of effort into refining some of the new cockpit designs, like just in terms of their silhouette and their just sort of the overall way that they work alongside the other parts, specifically the aircraft cockpits. And it's been very gratifying to have people like the new cockpits. I think you can make some pretty neat aircraft with them. I'll speak for Howard Mostrom, our sound designer and composer, in that he and the rest of us have been very, very excited by the degree to which our fans are aware of and appreciative of the huge amount of work he did on sound, and especially the dynamic score that changes depending on, the flight state of your vehicle. I think the music is gorgeous, and I'm really, really happy that so many people seem to agree with that.
I also really liked the music. How does the dynamic score work, and were there any difficulties with implementing that into the game?
Well, Howard is a miracle worker. That's how that works. I mean, the way the actual system works is it's aware of the flight state of the vehicle. It knows if you're in a ballistic trajectory or an orbital trajectory. It knows whether you're about to pass through an atmosphere. So it knows your altitude. Of course, it knows your physical location, which celestial body you're currently orbiting or descending toward or ascending from. It knows whether your altitude is changing in the positive or the negative dimension. So, we have a lot of data that Howard can be pulling from. And then he created an ingeniously layered score so that when you're in a situation of high tension, for example, you're on a ballistic trajectory and a very high rate of descent, he starts to layer in these kind of heavier drums, and then the opposite, when you move out into the vacuum and when your ascending ballistic trajectory turns into an orbit, things begin to sort of calm down and they become more ethereal. And it's so beautiful. I mean, a lot of people are asking when we're going to release an OST, and I think the answer is as soon uh, will it ever be done? I don't know. We need to keep encouraging Howard to make new scores for every new celestial body so that this can just keep going on forever. But I assume there'll be some common sense threshold where Howard feels he's completed enough that it can be collected and shared with the world. But yeah, I look forward to that. I will definitely be buying that OST.
What was the biggest challenge you faced while working on Kerbal Space Program 2?
I got to pick one. Patience. It's a very, very big and complicated game. And it is my job to articulate a vision for what the game will be. Not what it is today, but what it will be tomorrow. And these things don't happen quickly. And now it's not just me who's waiting for tomorrow. Now it's me and the community. We're all together. I'm just one of the fans now. And there is a degree to which having the community anticipating the evolution of the game, of course, increases the pressure a little bit too. So I suppose that's a part of the challenge as well. But yeah, I'm like a kid on Christmas. And what I've discovered is that the longer I wait for a feature, the more gratifying it is when it finally takes shape, when it finally clicks. And yeah, it almost feels a little bit like farming, like we're planting seeds and we're watering and we're weeding. And, sometimes it takes a while for the sprouts to come out. They always come out, but it's definitely, it's good that I'm old. It's good that I'm an old man now, and I've developed a little bit of patience, because I feel like if I was in my 20s, I'd be crawling out of my skin. But yeah, such is life.
So the game is currently in early access. What sort of updates and new content can players expect to see in the future?
So we've released a roadmap for what we expect to be releasing over the course of early access. The first probably really big update on the roadmap is science mode, which is the first of our progression modes. It is somewhat analogous to the science mode in KSP1. And in science mode, when you discover a new location or land at a new place, you gather a currency called science, and then you spend that currency at a research and development center to unlock new technologies. And that's kind of how you unlock the part progression. You get cooler new parts, and you can go farther and explore, and more difficult to access places. Your mission profiles become more ambitious. So that'll be the kind of next top line feature to arrive. And then over the coming months, we're looking at interstellar travel. Oh, I'm gonna get these in the wrong order. I apologize. Colonies, then interstellar travel, resource extraction, and exploration mode, which I described earlier. And then ultimately, the big crowning achievement is going to be multiplayer.
Exciting. Looking back now, is there anything that you wish you could have done differently before the launch into early access?
Well, I mean, it'd be easy enough for me to say I wish I had the magical ability to detect and correct all bugs prior to the first day of early access. But one of the great benefits of early access is it very rapidly informs you of what needs to be fixed in your game. So we had quite a journey over the first couple of weeks after release. Drinking from the fire hose, getting a huge amount of feedback about what was broken, what needed to be improved, and moving as aggressively as we could to correct those things. Some people, I think, sometimes assume that the order that the bugs get addressed is the same as our like priority order, and it has a little bit more to do with the difficulty of correcting each of the issues. Some of them are more complicated systems, take a little bit longer to correct. So I think I guess to some extent, I need to share with the community this journey of planting the seeds and watering the plant and waiting for the sprouts to come up. And yeah, that's there's going to be a little of that during early access for sure.
What would be your biggest piece of advice to a newer game dev trying to go and create their first game?
Try to make your own game. I'd be surprised how many people are hoping to kind of they may come with a little bit of maybe they have credentials, maybe they have some job specific skills, but I love to see an attempt. I love to see evidence that someone is a doer rather than a talker. And there are so many engines out there and so many tools out there. If you're a designer, you've got so many opportunities to show that you have an ambitious vision and that you're happy. We talk internally about the importance of getting clay on the wheel. You can't be too touchy about things being perfect before you start them. You just need to start them and then work on it, and you'll shape that clay into something beautiful. There's a Leonard Cohen lyric, which is ring the bells that still can ring, forget your perfect offering. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. And I have to constantly remind myself of that because, if you have perfectionist tendencies, you never start anything. So yeah, my advice would be get in there, get dirty, try to make something. And then even if it's a noble failure, that is still compelling. That is actually a thing that we would still love to see in a portfolio.
Thank you so much for your time. It's been great interviewing you.
Thank you very much for your time.
And that was the interview. If you enjoyed it and want to see more content like this, make sure to follow or subscribe. It's different on every platform. Also, if you have a friend who you think might like the show, make sure to share it with them. And if you really like the show, make sure to leave us a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. If you want to stay up to date with what's going on with Game Design Hour, make sure to follow us on Twitter, Instagram, or TikTok at Game Design Hour. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope I can see you next time.